Hello, beautiful people, and welcome, to the Escoffier post-release analysis. Before we get into any of the actual video, I just wanted to let you guys know that I'm planning on doing a charity stream where I'll be raising money for the American Heart Association on the 26th of May. It'll mostly be some non-Genshin stuff, but I still hope that we'll get a lot of participation if you're interested whatsoever. Come check out the stream on the 26th. I hope I'll see as many of you guys there as possible. So as usual, for the post-release video, we go through the pre-release video. We talk about what we got wrong, what we got right, what we just missed entirely, and that's pretty much it. So let's get right into it. We can skip past the explanation of her kit. I don't think anyone watching this video is completely clueless as to what she does. Just yesterday, we got our first very vague Skirk leaks that seem like they're actually real. So if you want to avoid leaks relating to Skirk specifically, here's your warning about that. Okay, so same warning again. If you want to avoid leaks altogether, but you still watch the post-release videos because you want to stay up to date with what I think about units, there's going to be a small section talking about Skirk right now, so you can skip using the timestamps. This hasn't changed so far. We're currently in V3 of beta, which is usually where the first major changes happen. They did a bit of numbers rebalance, but not too much. Skirk is a character who has a passive that's very similar to Neuvillette's passive, where basically the base multiplier of her attacks gets increased by a certain amount based on what your team comp is. In Neuvillette's case, all you need to do is trigger hydro reactions, which means that technically you can still gain some of his stacks if you're fighting elemental shields. You can gain some of his stacks if you get hit by a pyro attack on Kazuha and use that pyro to absorb pyro onto a Kazuha skill or burst, stuff like that. Skirk doesn't have that effect. For Skirk, it has to be a cryo character dealing cryo damage, or a hydro character dealing hydro damage. Skirk has a team comp related buff that is effectively dog shit if she doesn't have mono freeze, so only cryo and hydro units, and you cannot cheat out additional stacks through, for example, using Chongyun and cryo infusing a pyro unit's normal attack. That's not gonna work. Because of that, Skirk is heavily restricted to freeze teams, and out of the stuff I've calced, the best non-freeze team was like pretty much just worse than the worst possible freeze team. Mono freeze is something that Skirk is going to be pretty much entirely restricted to. The reason why this is important to Escoffier is because Escoffier has a very, very similar requirement, which also rewards you heavily for going mono freeze. If you're using Escoffier, you get 40% more shred if your last unit is also a mono freeze unit versus only having 3 of them, for a total of 55. What that means is that if you're planning on going for Skirk, the team building requirement that's basically necessary for Skirk to be able to function is the same as the team building requirement for Escoffier. Effectively, if you're already fulfilling it for one of them, then you get that same requirement for quote-unquote free for the second one. Which means the difference in terms of like overall team DPS between the teams that have Escoffier and the teams that don't is gonna be pretty big. Which means that even if if Skirk turns out to be as good as Mavuika, and this is indeed how it works, she'll be worse than Ayato if you don't have Escoffier. Okay, it's not quite to that extent. It's looking like you actually do outright lose 30% of your team DPS if you don't have Escoffier, and there's pretty much nothing you can do to change that. The best no Escoffier teams I looked at so far are just outright 30% behind the default options with Escoffier. That being said, if you don't have Farina, the gap gets a little bit smaller, because one of the main things that makes Escoffier so good in Skirk teams, not just in Skirk teams, in cryo teams in general, is that Escoffier is a unit that you want to put on your mono freeze team no matter what, because she's powerful enough for that, which means that your mono freeze team now always has a healer, which effectively means that you are now fulfilling the healing requirement for Farina by default. Before Escoffier, if you wanted to use Farina, you had to make a sacrifice. you would either sacrifice your cryo slot to a somewhat worse unit like Charlotte or Mika, or you'd sacrifice a different slot and you'd end up using something like Shilonen, which is fine, but if you've been on this channel for a while, you know what I think about Shilonen overall. But yeah, that effectively means that you get to fulfill the prerequisite for Farina more easily, but that also creates a situation where if you don't have Farina, one of the major upsides of Escoffier is now not something that you can capitalize on anymore, which makes it so that the gap between having Escoffier and not having her becomes a bit smaller if you don't have Farina. If this is indeed how it works, Skirk will be borderline unplayable without Escoffier. So right now, Skirk's numbers are looking pretty good. She won't be unplayable without Escoffier, but I'd say it's almost to the point where Barbara carry with Escoffier would be better than Skirk carry without Escoffier. Escoffier is a really big deal. Let's look at her ER requirements. So let's take a look at what if you're doing a Mavuika team where she's the one enabling your Mavuika to melt. So if she herself is not on Fav, ER requirements at around 242 if you want to burst every rotation. And honestly, I expect burst every rotation to be necessary as a part of your setup in a Mavuika team. Yeah, so if you don't burst every rotation in a Mavuika team, you basically just can't end up with a Cryo Aura on the enemy for Mavuika's burst to melt because you have too much pyro going on, and Escoffier solo cryo just isn't enough to overtake that. Which means that if you want to be able to actually get your melt on Mavuika, you need to burst every rotation on Escoffier, and because of that, and because she's solo cryo, the requirements will be really, really high. But there's some other pyro carries where you might not need to burst every rotation.
Your journey ends here. Your sacrifice is ready.
There's a few different setups you can do for this, but there are ways to end up with a Cryo Aura. It's pretty much just for Mavuika that it's really difficult because Mavuika, if you're using Escoffier as your Cryo, is almost forced to use Shiloden or Yonsan, which are characters that don't really help you that much at wiping your Pyro. I mean, Yonsan kind of does, but you still have Mavuika's off-field Pyro trying to overtake your stuff. And yeah, whereas if you are willing to use your Burst on Mavuika, I guess I'll show what happens if you don't use burst.
Your journey ends here. Your sacrifice is ready.
You gotta enter bike mode so that your off-field skill stops applying pyro and wait for like 3, 4, 5 seconds. It's not something that is worth doing at all. And so what you should actually do is to just accept that you'll have to use the burst. And the burst being 2U cryo allows you to get your melt very reliably. In double cryo, that's not a problem, obviously. And so, in the best case scenario, in teams where you generate a lot of cryo particles, she can pretty much trivially reach her ER requirements. In the worst case scenario, you'll need Fav and maybe ER sense on top of that. And in the average case scenario, it's generally either Fav or an ER sense. But you might be able to get away with a weapon that gives you ER that isn't Fav, but that gives you something else instead. Yeah, so I'd say that's pretty accurate. Because of all the different teams I've been playing her in, I generally don't change anything in her build. My build by default has 133 ER, which is generally what you need in the low ER teams. In the mid ER teams, I generally just swap the Skyward Spine, get to 170 ER. And in the high ER teams, I generally just swap the Fav, end up at around 165 with the Fav particles, and I'm fine. For general gameplay, I generally just keep her on Fav if I have a Fav available, just so I don't have to think about it too hard. So, now that we've talked a bit about her ER requirements, let's talk about all those weapon options. Okay, yeah, nothing to change here. We can take a look at the final weapons. I mean, I'd probably put Fav a bit higher overall, because there are a decent amount of teams that want the Fav. One thing that I didn't mention in here is that, and God, I really, really hate that it's real, but Melt Plunge Escoffier is actually one of the best clutch carries now. And it pisses me off. As it turns out, the fact that she has off-field cryo helps you get a larger amount of plunges before your buffs expire. The fact that, you know, she's an attack scaler means that when you get all your attack buffs, even when you're built for pyro plunge damage, it's all the attack buffs are still buffing your Escoffier damage. You're shredding a little bit for her own damage. Her plunge multiplier isn't great, but it's not awful. You get to actually use her skill, unlike what can end up happening in a lot of other pyro plunge carries that get like pyro infused by Bennett, where using their skills can interrupt your reactions. And unironically, it is pretty decent. If you want to play Escoffier carry, it is one of your options. But like, I hate it. I really do. If that's what you're doing, Ballad of the Fjords becomes pretty damn good. But yeah, let's move on. I never want to talk about Plunge Escoffier ever again. Oh, actually, also another thing before we move on from Plunge Escoffier, the fact that she has constant skill damage means that she can maintain max stacks on the new plunge set very easily, unlike a lot of the other plungers. Constellations! I don't have that much to say about cons. One thing I want to add, I guess, is Skirk related stuff, so again, warning for people that want to avoid leaks. Skirk, C1 and R1, from what I've looked at, seem to be fairly similar DPS increases to Skirk's teams when you compare them to Escoffier's C1. If you're a well considering getting this sort of stuff, if you also plan on playing different cryo characters, maybe going for Escoffier cons would be better. If you're not a whale or you don't know how many primos you want to spend on your stuff yet, you're worried that if you go for Escoffier C1, you won't end up having enough for Skirk, but you still want to go for cons on your Skirk team, there's no real downside to waiting for Skirk, getting Skirk, and then trying to go for her C1 instead of Escoffier's C1. That's pretty much all I have to change for Constellations. And finally, we have teams. And first, Ayaka. Ayaka is a character who gets by far the biggest upgrade from Escoffier. From calcs I've looked at, it seems like the Ayaka teams with Escoffier are like around 50% better than the Ayaka teams without her. And also, just want to like clarify something here. Math can be very misleading, okay? Because when I talk about something being 50% better, that's not at all the same thing as that other thing being 50% worse. Like, 15 is 50% bigger than 10, but 10 is not 50% smaller than 15. When you swap your numerator and denominator, the percentage difference changes too, right? It's only 33%. So I just want to make it very clear, okay, when I say 50% bigger, it's like 15 instead of 10. It's not 15 instead of 7.5, which would be like the opposite of 50% smaller. That means that the non-Escoffier Ayaka teams are doing about 70-ish%. Maybe a bit less, maybe a little more, because it's a lot of approximation going in there, but yeah. The next carry I want to talk about is Neuvillette. A nice upside that isn't mentioned that much is that Escoffier's buff does not need to be refreshed. When you're playing what is currently the best Neuvillette teams, this is generally what your rotations look like. You start with a Neuvillette E, then you Farina E, then you Shilonen E, optional Q, Kazuha E, optional Q, Farina Burst, Neuvillette Charge Attack, Skill Charge Attack, Burst, and then refresh your buffs because otherwise they expire. And then you do another 2 charge attacks. But as you can see, looking at my skill cooldown, my rotation is a decent amount longer than 24 seconds. The fact that you have to go refresh the buffs effectively locks you into longer rotations because refreshing the buffs and then the time that it takes to do 2 charge attacks on top of that charge attack you did after the second skill, it means you end up with around 26, 27, 28 second rotations. If you didn't have to go refresh your buffs, I get to use my skill almost right after the cooldown is back. And then one additional thing here is that if you're also using units that have animation times faster than Kazuha and Shilonen, which are both fairly slow, it means you might end up being able to use your burst before your skill on Neuvillette and effectively take that amount of time and put it beforehand. Let's show what that looks like real quick. And as you can see, I actually get to use my E literally instantly. So it actually is a 24-second rotation. This specific rotation misses fanfare uptime on the last charge attack, so there's a few different ways you can go about it, a few different things that can be slightly better or worse. You can adjust your rotation, either a 24-second exactly rotation with a little bit less fanfare uptime, or like a 25-ish second with more fanfare uptime. But all this to say, you end up with significantly shorter rotations pretty much no matter what when you're using these Escoffier teams, and because your rotations happen shorter but you get the same amount of charge attack, that obviously is going to increase your DPS. And just that difference in rotation time tends to be a bigger DPS increase than the damage you lost from having 1 stack instead of 2. Then all the other factors start coming into play. Now, if you have Sacrificial Jade for Neuvillette, it won't be ideal because you need to swap out of Neuvillette in order to keep that passive. Yeah, so that's true, but also not necessarily that big of a deal, because if you do the setup we talked about earlier, you can swap out after your burst skill, and then swap back in to do the 3 charge attacks. And if that's what you do, this is where the Sac Jade buff runs out. At the end of the third one, and then you do your skill, and then you swap out and you go do your setup, and your setup ends up taking more than 5 seconds, so you get the buff back for the next rotation. On top of that, you don't really have a great third hydro, which means that you likely are going to want to use a second cryo instead. And if you use a second cryo, you get Cryo Resonance, and with Sac Jade, you'll be Omega over. Oh yeah. Anyway, one thing to mention here. Quickly, I want to talk about Citlali in these teams. The biggest obstacle to these teams being, without the shadow of a doubt, the best Neuvillette teams is a mix of 2 things. One, Citlali isn't as good in freeze teams as she is in melt teams. And 2, Citlali is an important part of Mavuika's best team. So if you want to be playing Mavuika, you won't be able to put Citlali in your Neuvillette team. And the alternatives to Citlali are weaker. The Hydro Shred is still kind of useful, and obviously the Cinder City is also pretty nice. Here's the thing, and again, leaker's warning, Skirk is going to end up being better than Citlali as a last slot. Quick Swap Skirk is actually good enough that it's going to be an upgrade to these teams. It is what it is, I guess. I stand by this team being the best Neuvillette team right now. It's a lot easier, and that's saying something because Neuvillette teams are already easy to play, but it's even easier to play than the other Neuvillette teams. It's more comfortable. Freeze is such a useful thing to have against a lot of different freezable enemies. If you have played a freeze team against a Wayob like ever in your life, you will understand the power of the freeze reaction. One other useful thing is, with the addition of the new endgame mode that requires 3 teams, Escoffier freeing Kazuha and Chilonen from your Neuvillette team can also be meaningful if you are playing characters that want either of those. Next is gonna be pretty much all the other Cryo and Hydro carries. They all get upgrades from Escoffier, except maybe Mualani. I don't want to be a Mualani hater. I think her kit is cool. I think that having an actual dedicated forward vape character is really nice, and it's something we needed in Genshin. And I think that her kit design and her kit mechanics are really, really well done. But I'm a Mualani hater by necessity, alright? I don't want to hate her, but I have to, because I know people listen to me. Okay? I can't just ignore her problems and sing her praises, despite me sometimes wanting to. And here's the thing, just in terms of DPS, Freeze Mualani isn't that much worse than Vape Mualani, and in terms of quality of life, it effectively doesn't have any of the problems that Vape Mualani does. And so, I would say Freeze Mualani is actually a meaningfully better team than Vape Mualani if you're not going for whale stuff, if you're not going for cons or sig. An important part of the reason for that is the quality of life, and if you don't care about that at all, if you're someone who's willing to reset, I wouldn't say it's an upgrade. Let's talk about Wriothesley. I expect the Yelan teams to be better than the Shenhe teams with Wriothesley Escoffier, but it is a pretty sizable upgrade to his current freeze teams, and it's going to make his freeze teams competitive, if not slightly better than his melt teams. So yeah, this was like Omega underselling. Competitive, if not slightly better. Try significantly better. Yeah, they're significantly better than his melt and other non-freeze teams. Might not be the case for like whale stuff, but for C0 or Zero stuff, it's not even close. Other than that, we have Ganyu. With Ganyu, I think it's going to be a very small upgrade. So your best options for freeze Ganyu are going to be Escoffier, Farina, Ganyu, +1, and that +1, because she doesn't have great synergy with Shenhe or with Yelan, is going to be worse. Either you're playing a character with better synergy, that's not as good, or you're playing a character with worse synergy, like Shenhe and Yelan, and you lose out because the synergy isn't as good. But it's still going to be a small upgrade, because in the worst case scenario, you just wheelchair with 65k DPS and do normal attack Ganyu, or on-field Yelan with a Ganyu burst. There is a character that actually goes pretty well here. A Hydro character that gives you Hydro Resonance on Farina and good particle generation that can wear TDDS and give you a bunch of damage %. That's right, it's Mualani. Mualani is actually a decent support in a team like this, and not just for Ganyu, but also for other cryo carries, and leaker warning again. She'll be one of the best options for Skirk, because Skirk is in a similar situation to Ganyu for slightly different reasons. She also has anti-synergy with Shenhe. She doesn't have anti-synergy with Yelan, but because she's much stronger than Ganyu, a character whose main appeal is their personal damage, is inherently starting with a handicap compared to characters whose main appeal is buffing. If you increase your damage by 20%, but your carry at a baseline is Wriothesley, it ain't doing shit. But if you increase your damage by 20% and your carry at a baseline is Mavuika, that's a big deal. That's why Yelan isn't that insane in the slot, and because Mualani offers significantly more powerful buffs, she actually does end up becoming a fairly solid option. Other than that, you have, I suppose, Arlecchino. You could also use Escoffier as the off-field cryo in a melt team. It'll work. It'll be like Rosaria. The speed of application for Escoffier is she applies cryo every other hit, and it hits every second. So it's the exact same speed as Rosaria, but it lasts for longer, which means anything that Rosaria enables for reactions, Escoffier will enable as well. Yeah, the one thing I want to mention here when it comes to using Escoffier with Arlecchino, unlike Citlali, you have your application every 2 seconds the whole time, as opposed to Citlali's application being front-loaded at the very start from her skill hitting every 2 seconds, but also the burst Spirit Skull Vessel explosion that happens towards the start of your carry's uptime. And that means that you might have to wait for like half a second, because Arlecchino applies Pyro a little bit faster than once every 2 seconds. So, if I just mash my normal attacks, I will end up overtaking and losing some melt because of it. You might have to wait a little bit, and something to keep in mind if you end up having to wait is that if you wait at the wrong time, it will change your reactions. It will make it so that your reactions aren't happening on the same hits, right? So what I mean by that is, if I wait here, you end up getting a melt on your third or your second or third hit instead of only on your first hit always. And so generally you want to wait, you want to put your waiting periods in between each either 2 and 3s or 1 and 5. Like, I can wait here, no problem. But you don't want to do 1 and 3 and then wait. All in all, Escoffier's going to be a very versatile character, but also not, right? Like, she's going to be powerful enough that even outside of her niche, she'll be good, but obviously she'll be a lot better in her niche. It's just, I really don't like her design in the sense that I never liked character restrictions, things that actively restrict the teams you can do. I like that at least she still works outside of teams with that fulfill the restrictions, but I don't know how to feel about the fact that her teams for the crowd carries are a lot better than their other teams. I haven't really changed my mind on that. I think that Escoffier is a really boring character. My thoughts on her power level overall have like slightly changed. They haven't really changed in nature, they're just somewhat intensified, I guess, after testing her more and thinking about it more, and after the Skirk leaks we've had. I think Escoffier is probably better than I gave her credit for in the pre-release. She's is definitely one of the best characters in the game. One thing about Escoffier that's kind of weird is that Furina existing makes healing more valuable, but it's hard to properly attribute whose power that is. Is that Furina's power or is that the healer's power? To me, I think I lean more towards saying that it's a healer's power than Furina's power, because Furina's passive is worthless if you don't have a healer, but healing is still healing if you don't have Furina. But if they keep releasing a lot of powerful healers like Escoffier, then the healing requirement is going to become trivial to use, and then it will make a lot more sense to attribute the power of that fanfare buff all to Furina rather than split between her and the healer. Right now, though, I'd say that Escoffier is definitely up there as one of the strongest characters in the game. I think that she actually is competing with Bennett for the title of best support. I think Escoffier is better for freeze than Citlali is for melt. I think that's saying something. And I think she's very much a continuation of the power creep trend, which kind of sucks. Something I've realized lately is, like, it's like Hoyo's trying to make me feel conflicted, because they're finally adding some of the stuff that we've been asking for such a long time, but at the same time, they're also making incredibly blatant and kind of shitty power creep. So on one hand, I'm really happy, and on the other, I'm pissed off. Like, I'm really happy that we're finally getting new forms of endgame content. On top of that, it seems like co-op is actually going to be meaningful. So we're going to get actual co-op things to do. Having more endgame content is great, and I'm glad we're finally getting that. We're supposedly getting artifact presets, but like for real next patch. Only 2 presets per character, but still. Like, these are the sort of things that I've been asking for such a long time. But them coming at the same time as this incredibly blatant power creep makes me feel very conflicted. All that being said, Escoffier overall, powerful character. Not really that much else to say. She's strong. If you care about any Hydro Cryo carries, she's probably going to be an upgrade for you. And I'm pissed off. As usual, hope you guys enjoyed. Hope you learned a thing or two. Reminder, I'm doing a charity stream on the 26th. I'll probably be starting stream around 10 or 11 a.m. EST, but I will be making a community post on YouTube when I do start. So make sure to drop by if you'd like to contribute. I would very much appreciate that. And I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.